Okay, and we are live.
There you go. All right, welcome everyone. It is February 4th, 2025. This is the House Committee on Energy and Digital Infrastructure. It's 2 p.m. We're going to hear from Commissioner Garrett Johnson from the Department of Public Service, and then from TJ Poor, Director of Regulated Utility Planning and Public Service Department. After that, it's our custom to go around the room and introduce ourselves and also all of our guests. So we'll start. I'm Scott Campbell. I'm Vice Chair of the committee. I am from St. Johnsbury, representing Caledonia Essex District.
Richard Bailey, Lamoille 2.
Chris Morrow, Wyndham, Windsor, Bennington.
Michael Southworth, Caledonia 2.
Christopher Howland, Rutland 4.
Derek Torrey, Washington 2.
Graham Klubner, Chittenden 13, Burlington.
Laura Civilian, Wyndham 2. But my apologies.
Jack Roth, Committee Assistant. Oh, sorry.
That's okay. Representative Kathleen James joining remotely today from Manchester.
Yes, Madam Chair. And we'll go around the room, please.
Peter Sterling, Renewable Energy Vermont. Glenn Russell, BT Digger.
Emma Cotton, BT Digger. Gabrielle Molina, Down Draco Martin, Public Affairs.
TJ Poor, Department of Public Service.
Dylan Zwicky, Wayne Public Affairs.
Matt Cotto with Meadow Hill.
Okay,
I'm Camden Simpson. I'm an intern with Jeremy Little.
okay, great. All right, thank you. Commissioner, introduce yourself for the record, and please, tell us what you can tell us.
Thank you very much. For the record, my name is Garrett Johnson. I'm Commissioner of the Vermont Department of Public Service, and in conversations with the chair, I understand my task here to be to give you a little bit of a briefing on what we understand about the currently nascent 10% energy tariff on energy imports and potential impacts on Vermont. First, I think it's just good to just take a step back here and acknowledge how this rolled out. We were starting to talk, I think it was 10:04, at least that's when I first read. I was monitoring, I had 2 phones and my iPad, and my wife was watching All Creatures Great and Small, and I was trying to go to CNN to monitor to figure out, okay, is that in fact going to hit, or was there a last minute deal? But crossed on 10:04, about 10:18, the work began. And so with our colleagues, with our department, with the folks we regulate, and I can tell you, Madam Chair and committee, that I have been gratified with the collaboration and the amount of work that I'll be able to reference here today. But I'd also stress to emphasize, there are so many major questions that we have. We don't have the specific language of the tariff. We don't have, it has not been, it was actually further clarification was supposed to be provided in a public notice in the Federal Register. It was published in the Federal Register and then withdrawn. And even then, what was in referenced another like 3,000 page document, which most of my team and most of the team in Vermont doesn't have familiarity with. So I'll give you a snapshot of what we understand today, and I'll probably end with pointing in direction how we're hoping to handle these kinds of challenges or shocks to the system, maybe I could say, and put another way to look more optimistically, opportunities, you could say, because this is going to be the world we're going to be living in for at least the next 4 years. So how do we best prepare ourselves and to do something constructive? So with that, I think I just hit all the things that I wanted to say. Yes. Now we have every expectation. I have some notes here. I'll read some of them. So my apologies for reading, and then we'll riff and go back and forth. One thing I want to stress right off the bat is even if in some possible worst case scenario, Hydro-Quebec were to say, not one electron are we going to send back through Vermont into New England, the electric grid will remain reliable. So let me repeat, that is an important consideration. In this particular case, determine that reliability, that falls under the auspices with the distribution utilities, but a primary function of Vermont Electric Power Company, VELCO. Their job is to run scenario analyses every 15 minutes about what might happen to the system. in addition to longer term shocks like this. They currently assure me and my team, even if even with the weather that is expected, the grid will remain reliable. So Vermonters can be assured of that. And I think that was our question number one is, let's make sure the lights stay on. So the answers to that are good. So that's, I think, an important threshold outcome that I wanted to share with you. Secondly, there are other threshold questions for which we do not have answers. What I thought would be helpful was to touch on illustratively some of the key utilities, because I think they point to the impacts on the broader ratepayer base. The first one I wanted to touch on was VGS, used to be Vermont Gas Systems. That's the cleanest one to sort of look at just in terms of the impact of the imposition of tariff and impact on customers. So in that regard, and I should also say this, just as I am in here today testifying on this, and as your chair will attest, I did ask her, does it make sense for me to testify given that this has been pulled back? And she insisted that there was still value, for which I am grateful, because I do think there is. But similarly, from the governor on down, the work continues to understand this, just as a matter of prudent caution. It is, we don't know what's going to happen in 29, 28 days. So the work continues to understand and where necessary mitigate some possible impacts. So I'll give you a status report on the work that's going on, the results of the work we know so far. Rest assured that work does continue. So for VGS, based on the best available information, they're looking at a gross impact of about between $6 and $7 million. They are now, and they have some levers they can pull and push. They are looking at mitigation strategies. And I want to make sure I get this right, to include and looking at options for modifying existing tariff provision, as well as customer rate class treatment within those current tariff as adopted, and perhaps even changes to their sourcing and composition of the fuel mix. Where do they purchase some of the gas that they use? Because there's large purchases in Canada. Honestly, how much percentage of some of them are renewable farms, the digesters and the like? There's several levers that they can bring into bear, but what makes sense depending on the interpretation and the exact language of the tariff when it's put in place. So Neil Lenderville and his team are, yeah, go ahead.
No, I don't want to interrupt you, but
Okay.
do you want to take questions along the way? Or
Yeah, let's,
okay.
yes, please.
Yeah, and Mr. Wonderville was in last week, but
Okay.
I just wanted to ask for more definition around that, 6 to 7 million. So
Yeah.
what does that encompass? Is there a period of time that 6 to 7 million represents?
My understanding that's an annual additional cost that they would seek to have to recover.
From their rate.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. If this were to be imposed, the logical time or the established time for seeking to have some kind of rate adjustment in response to the tariff, this is another thing I wanted to leave for the committee, would be May of this year. So they're going to have time to do the work, time to discuss it with you all, understand the impacts of the tariff, and then whatever changes ultimately are sought or identified as being necessary in their view, they would propose those changes in May. And they are assuring me that all of the efforts, I mean, we said 6 to 7 million, they're looking at everything possible to mitigate to the greatest degree possible what those impacts might be. And they're in contact with their customers. You know, there's some, obviously, their residential customers as well as some of their industrial customers to ensure that they are apprised of this. I did have a conversation with Neil regarding the appetite for volatility among some of his owners, like how much of a shock just for various companies. And he reminded me when Russia invaded Ukraine, for instance, there was a big shock there. So it isn't like that community of customers is completely, have been completely insulated from shocks. They're aware that things like this that happen, maybe more so than other customers. So that's just a data point I thought I'd share. Now let's get with VGS to the Hydro-Quebec contract. And so first I thought it would be good to share with you just some of the parameters to level set. So in general, because there's difference within individual utilities, the Hydro-Quebec contract constitutes about 24% of the state's portfolio. That's prior to the disposition, how we handle renewable energy certificates, which is a whole nother category, which also the treatment of which in any energy tariff is not clear at all.
TJ, can you open the door a little bit, please? Yeah, that's good.
Well, it's a bigger room now.
It's a big room.
Yes. Oh, more, yeah.
Oh, it's somebody.
I'll take that as counsel, as feedback. Okay. So that amounts, I told you the percentage, that's about 218 to 225 megawatts per year, 218 to 225, until 2035 when it starts to step down to 56 megawatts in 2038, when currently that's when it's scheduled to end, 2038.
So could you hit those figures one more time?
Sure. And I'll be glad to provide a copy of this to Mr. Locker. 218 to 225 per year until 2035. 2035 is when it starts to step down, ultimately to 56 megawatts in 2038, when currently that contract is due to end. For those who are interested, that's a total of 1.3 terawatt hours. Okay.
Sorry, Alan, your question.
Thank you. Hydro-Quebec, do they have a timeframe on their licensing for these dams? And will they affect what we're gonna see being able to come down?
I'm sorry, what's the last question?
Would it affect what we're able to see come down into the state for purchase?
That's a really good question. I honestly don't know the licensing provision. It's not like the 401 certification process that we have in the US. I'm not sure there's certain, but I will tell you there's been deals reached with Ontario between Quebec and Labrador, Newfoundland on new deals. They're expanding. Now they're expanding in how much capacity they currently have and what the new capacity will, when new capacity will arrive and how much, and what does that portend for Vermont market to the degree Vermont has an appetite for additional Hydro-Quebec power. All those things are in play, but I honestly don't know the licensing. That's never been raised as an obstacle, quite honestly. What has been raised is simply, and just varying points of view, two things I would say. One is the net capacity for export, and then two, just the political atmosphere against which these decisions are made. It's much more populist now, and that's just the table stakes now are understanding it needs to be a bilateral trade arrangement, not simply we'll get a check and we'll send them a check and we get electrons. They're looking for a lot more. Now it's about value for value swaps, really. And that's where Vermont could be well positioned, which leads to a whole other conversation. So I hope that responds to your question. So the cost for this power, you may be aware, at the time it was set, there was two like fundamental principles in play: a pure market-based approach to the contract versus a set price for the contracted power for this period of time. When you have a set price, what you lose in overall, you'll pay more because you're paying for price stability. That's essentially the trade-off. If you have a more volatile contract for power, more straight market-based, then you'll enjoy the market if in fact the market isn't enjoyable.
I just want to clarify, you said a flat rate, we will pay more.
You would, excuse me, if you had a set price for the life of the contract, that price that was set that you would pay would be higher than the straight market price for probably long periods of time, because you're essentially monetizing the value of stability and certainty as to how much it's going to be. Does that make sense?
But you're not saying that we're paying more because we're regulating.
No,
price.
no,
Okay.
no. And in fact, I think over time, I've been doing this long enough to when it was been really popular, when brief periods of time, people hated it, but like 90% of the time, Vermont regulators, policymakers have been grateful that that contract is in place. Thank you for ensuring I got that clear. So the interesting thing here is, again, the threshold question. It's not clear at all. My understanding, I don't have independent corroboration on this nor direct conversations, but our utilities and my team is looking at, not sure at all that even if the energy tariff is implemented, it would apply to the Hydro-Quebec contract, and I'll get into a couple of reasons why that is. I also want to foreshadow the unique nature of the impact on Vermont Electric Cooperative. We'll get into it because told you about VGS, and I told you I was going to touch on a couple, I think, illustrative utilities just to give you a feel for some of the complexities. I'll get into that. But I told you that annual true, well, I was starting to get into the contract provisions. Essentially, the compromise that was made was we're going to have a bandwidth. There's going to be an agreed upon price. That agreed upon price can adjust, is adjusted annually based on a host of factors. I've seen the list of factors. It's a lot, but essentially how do you reconcile market forces and market impacts with the market for wholesale electricity is plus other entries into that formula. However, there's a ceiling and there's a floor. So the idea was, that was the compromise. We want to have a level of certainty so that price can float within that agreed upon bandwidth. When it was originally posited that it might be a 25% increase, most people, I certainly believe that would just blow through the ceiling. It would just, and then instantly likely that would lead to instant litigation because the contract provisions and how you treat this particular executive order driven tariff and how the construct just in the executive order, because we didn't have tariff language, exactly what the impacts are. At 10%, it's less clear, but again, it's not clear at all that it even applies to the contract, which I'll get into. There's just one other thing that I wanted to make sure that's clear. Oh yeah. Here's some of the tariff considerations related to the Hydro-Quebec contract. Because the tariff applies to electricity or electricity transactions. And how does that apply to this contract? Because the actual purchase power and sales agreement, and this is where this gets quickly or instantly tedious, but this is the important stuff. The actual purchase and sales agreement is with Hydro-Quebec US, not Hydro-Quebec. It's HQ US that has the agreement. It's one of Hydro-Quebec's subsidiaries. It's what's called an internal bilateral transaction. Hadn't heard that phrase until we started looking at it. An internal bilateral transaction, and it's not, importantly, it's not tied to a specific physical delivery point. First Hydro-Quebec contract specified deliveries would be through the Highgate converter in Highgate, Vermont. This one doesn't specify that. It specifies a sales point, which is that converter in Highgate point, but not how ultimately it's, because there's like at least 4 or 5 major ways that that energy can be delivered. That is a key consideration because given the nature of that transaction doesn't in fact come under the rubric of the tariff as we understand it. That is not clear at all because it isn't tied to specific physical deliveries.
So we're buying from HQ US, but presumably HQ US buys from HQ Quebec. And presumably that transaction would be subject to tariffs. Is that possible or accurate?
Great point. You're going down exactly the cognition trail we were following, which one might assume, okay, if you're HQ US, yeah, we're not sure if this disqualifies for having to pay the tariff as well. Your presumption was where we went to, but I'm not sure that that's the case. I mean, you're right to follow it there, but I'm not sure that that's the case. At least, again, initially secondhand, I had been talking, in fact, the representative from HQ, given this was going on, I was in my office last Friday, and we were talking through some of these things. Some of it was just unclear. I mean, excuse me, the major points are unclear, I should stress. So with that, what I thought, Madam Chair, Mr. Vice Chair, is that one thing most parties agree, if in fact if it's affected, and notwithstanding, we'll have to determine the impacts on the Vermont contract itself. It is clear that there will be an impact on the wholesale market price for energy. Because exactly what happens, because that's a market. And HQ is a powerful key participant in the New England energy market.
So you're talking ISO New England?
Correct. ISO New England, independent system operator New England does three things, one of which is to run that competitive wholesale market. Most people say, okay, if that happens, whatever happens with other stuff, clearly they'll honor their contractual terms, but it's also, all right, how do we best posture our resources given this into our market? So it may be, we're not going to make the money we think we should given this. So until we make our nut here, and then the price goes way up, okay, now we'll sell. There's these kinds of game theory scenarios regarding how they posture their portfolio, you can kind of get lost in a loop. But bottom line is, it's likely, if this indeed is levied, is imposed, that wholesale market prices for electricity will go up.
I want to go back to a statement that you made earlier around reassuring that the grid would stay up if power came down, but it would stay up buying into the wholesale market, right?
The lights will stay on. The grid will stay reliable, and then the question will be, what's the price?
Because they'll be buying in the spot market instead of just the contract.
Great point, which is why I thought the next thing would be good to share with you. What's the exposure? What's the need of Vermont Utilities? Because they still can't abrogate the contract. So you can still honor the contract, and maybe or maybe not that's going to be subject to the tariff. But separate and distinct in addition to the deliveries under that contract for Vermont Utilities, there's so much more energy they have, and that's being put into the market. Their decisions for marketing that and selling that power in the wholesale competitive, separate from contractual obligations, that's what I'm talking about. But the Vermont Utilities don't have 100% all their eggs in this Hydro-Quebec contract basket. So I thought what would be useful would be give you a quick snapshot of the exposure of the Vermont Utilities to the spot market.
We'll see. And just for context,
Yeah.
what proportion of power that Hydro-Quebec exports to the U.S. is contractually obligated to Vermont Utilities versus to ISO New England generally? Roughly.
I roughly don't know. Part of me wonders, honestly, if that's because now that's interesting. That might even be proprietary information, quite honestly. Well, I don't know.
Yeah.
If you need me, I can certainly ask, but I don't know that off the top.
I know how much they have capacity to deliver.
For the record, this is TJ Poor.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
They have capacity, I think, to deliver around 1,600 megawatts into New England, but it is as the commissioner said, around 215 to 235 comes to Vermont under that contract, but it is unclear exactly what specific contracts they have for guaranteed firm delivery with other load serving entities in New England and how much they might just play the market themselves. It's going to be a mix.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, so I know you're about to tell us the exposure for the individual utilities, which I very much want to hear.
Yeah.
And I know we're probably getting to the end of your time. Something else I would really like to hear about and that I worry about in kind of the chaos that we've seen come to life here pretty early in this administration. And that is, it's really important to me to be able to communicate to my constituents. I'm sure it is to you and the governor as well, to be able to communicate to Vermonters. So this is helpful. Thank you, Madam Chair, for arranging for this testimony. Thank you for agreeing to come. But how have you given any thought about, how this would be communicated, to Vermonters at the level of chaos that we're seeing? So, and speed of the chaos.
I'm going to give you a quick answer, then I'm going to come to that at the very end.
Thanks.
On that, precisely on that point. One thing that, and this is interesting because I had some discussion with my team on this. For me, it was, quite honestly, when you have like a flood and there's devastation, okay, you want to hear from the government. When something like this, when some of these questions, and I am seeking to give you an effective snapshot so you can briefly take out your tasks and job, at the same time kind of honoring what I have learned from the individual distribution utilities as they continue to conduct and experiment. And so that's kind of the balance I'm trying to see. But in the instant when this was starting to come up, the message we all agreed, and it was honestly the utilities themselves, in my opinion, that have the clearest relationship with their own customers. So my exhortation to them was communicate with your customers and make sure you do that. I'll weigh in, we have that consistent with my boss, with the governor, exactly how we're sending those messages. So thank you for asking the question because it does give me a lead in. But I'm open to feedback on that. Most people don't know me, right? They don't know. In the department, I'm not sure what views they might have, notwithstanding the great work TJ and the rest of the team do. However, they know they're a local utility. And so that's where I thought invested the people closest to the people in the neighborhoods where they probably see people who work for Green Mountain Power, Vermont Electric Co-op in the store, in a church, or wherever they might, ball field or ice rink or something. Arm those people to be the ambassadors of, look, this is what's going on. Here's what we know, here's what we don't know. That isn't to say I won't at the appropriate time. Right now, I think myself and my team is best situated to gather, analyze, and then help identify strategies and either give encouragement or chastise the leadership of various utilities as is necessary. And they understand, if that responds.
Yeah, for one member, I will tell you that makes a lot of sense.
Okay. So exposure to the market. And this just, I will tell you, having gone through this, third weekend, fourth weekend for me, this was, should I not acknowledge, but there's been real stuff that I have learned doing, I did my thing, but learning this at this level of detail here, there is value to that. And we've had to stress test communication networks and how we work. So there can be value to these things. I wish it wasn't the case, but I'm an optimist trying to find a positive here. So that is good. So exposure, BED, none. Zero exposure to the market. Green Mountain Power, none. No exposure to the market. Stowe, 12%. WEC, Washington Electric Co-op, 1%. Hyde Park, 3.5% of their portfolio. VIPSA, Vermont Public Power Supply Authority, 5%. And Vermont Electric Co-op, 10%. So when I got those, okay, I showed you the power of hedging. It kind of shows between the legislature, the department, and now the Public Utility Commission, we place a premium on stability, right? I guess I feel compelled to add here, New England's a high price region for electricity. It is, for a whole bunch of reasons. But within New England, Vermont is has some of the lowest rates. And it's been that way for a while. Of course, we can do better, but it just put that data point up. Yeah.
Just a clarifying question. You said GNP was zero?
Zero exposure to the open having to purchase power on the wholesale market.
So where would they get the 25% that they currently get from Hydro Quebec if there was an issue there?
Oh, I'm sorry, 25% in general, so you can actually do a rough justice, say 25% of Green Mountain Power's power supply portfolio is from Hydro Quebec. They have additional contracts, I think with Millstone, they have in-state hydro facilities that round out their portfolio. But currently, this is a snapshot, they don't have to go to market to supplement purchases. Does that make sense?
Currently, I thought we were talking about if there was an issue with.
Oh, I apologize. This is right now, the contract is all set. The point is, in your power, if you see like an investment portfolio, okay, yeah. this contract to them, this doing this.
Yeah. Okay, I'm with you. Yeah, they came last week.
Scale. Yeah. Try not to set off the carbon monoxide. Gotcha. Sure. One thing though is, this is where maybe under the rubric of no good deed goes unpunished. Vermont Electric Co-op and their leadership have done very creative tonight work on helpful arrangements with their Canadian neighbors, not just at the transmission, at the distribution operational level. So they have agreements directly with Hydro-Quebec to exchange blocks of 18 to 20 megawatts of power when at best they come to a collaborative agreement. They have some contractual arrangements. And there are times, for instance, okay, peak load. Well, let's shift 20. In Vermont, as roughly 1,000 megawatt load, Not sure what VEC's like service territory load requirement is, some portion of that. But it's provided great value. Now, however, with this energy tariff, it puts them in a little bit more complicated a position. They have 4 delivery points for energy from Hydro-Quebec. Now, I talked with the general manager of Vermont Electric Co-op, Rebecca Town, and she has shared with me, and I think she shared publicly. So here, I'm comfortable. The rough justice, and remember, the energy tariff for a time was going to be 10%. Excuse me, 25%, excuse me, for it was identified as 10. But what VEC's analysis, initial, with all kinds of caveats, but I thought it would be helpful, at 25, excuse me, if it were to increase by 10%, so the updated energy tariff of 10%, it would cost VEC in the range of $2 million per year. $2 million a year to Vermont Electric Co-op translates into a 2% rate increase. I think that that would be done for them, their timing. We talked about VGS in May. If that were to happen, theirs is in March for a tariff change implementation. So that's there. Now, that also, though, makes some assumption, which I told you we had been thinking would be the case of an overall increase in the wholesale market prices. What they're assuming is some of the ISO New England and the energy they get from there, as I said, in their open 10% open position, where they have to make spot market purchases, they're counting that in their calculation on the 2 million impact and then the associated rate increase. There again, just as with VGS, just as with Green Mountain Power, each of these companies, they have some tools they can work with. So they're looking to try and manage that as effective and find ways to mitigate costs. We've certainly challenged that, and they have taken of their own volition. For VIPSA, because that's a conglomerate, you know, the joining of really small municipal utilities, they have, they're a 78 megawatt peak system. So of the roughly 1,000 that's Vermont, VIPSA's members collectively are 78 megawatts. They have 70 under contract, but only 2 megawatts with Hydro-Quebec. So they largely moved away. So they're in good shape. And they're in good shape. Nonetheless, they're looking to mitigate and see if there's some deals to be done, but that's happening. Yeah. I'm sorry.
Rep James has a question for you.
I can wait though. I don't want to interrupt you if you're on a roll.
I tell you, because this might introduce you this might interest you as well.
Okay.
And I'm going to go back to Representative Sebelius' question. 2 things I want to say. One is this is one channel of challenge that we have, and analysis needs to be done, and work that we're doing to understand this. That's in addition to other executive orders from the federal government regarding the disposition of funds, whether it's the Inflation Reduction Act, the bipartisan infrastructure law, and even there's some other laws where we were really fortunate. Senator Sanders secured about a $62 million Solar for All grant. We're not sure of the disposition of those funds. It changes daily. It changes daily in terms of the program. It changes daily in terms of the program and the people we're required to work with. It changes daily in terms of the interpretation of the language and what's being sent. We have over 630 million worth of contracts we're administering. I can't say every dollar is kind of thrown into that trick box. The vast majority is, though. So we have this over here on this potential executive order energy tariff, and we have all those that are going now that are directly impacting our ability to do what we've committed to this body, this particular committee, this body, into the governor's team, what we're supposed to be doing. That does have an impact. I want to put that there. In the larger sense, though, in terms of communication, what do we do? This is going to be the rule for 4 years. The governor on Sunday, and I don't want to get ahead. There's a press release coming today. I would simply say this. There is a task force that was formed at the cabinet level, of which the department is one member. And the idea here is, how can we be focused? How can we be disciplined? How can we be responsive but not reflexive in terms of our posture? I think it's a great idea. And can we identify areas or ways to better advantage Vermont communities? I've learned a lot more about tariffs. I had my understanding, and it's an interesting story about the utilization in the United States history, which I had no idea, but I was directed to read some stuff, and I did my homework, and it was interesting. So the point here is we're looking for a broader, consistent framework for response and policy and analysis and impact and development. So we're not inadvertently or we're not consciously contributing to that chaos, and be mindful of look for the good and see what we can accomplish. So with that, I'll stop.
That was terrific. Thank you, Commissioner, for coming in. Do you have a question?
I do, I don't know if the chair.
Oh, all right. So
I
the
have a
chair's got her
question.
hand up. Madam Chair, do you have your?
Yeah, thanks so much for coming in, Commissioner. I'm trying to kind of bring this all down to the level of ratepayers and Vermonters. And, you know, as we look to the pause, and the fact that we could be looking at 4 more years of, you know, volatile, unpredictable decision-making from the White House, what you had mentioned that you're encouraging utilities to communicate directly with their customers, which I think is great, and I think that's really important. What more active role do you think the state or the legislature or your department should play in making sure that is there anything we can do to mitigate the impacts of tariffs like this if the time passes and negotiations with Canada aren't going the way that the president likes them and he slaps the tariffs back down? What can we do besides just, I'm looking for a Vermont ratepayer-centered strategy that we can try to do that isn't just feeling like we're at the whim of decisions that come down from the White House. And I'm sorry that's not a very focused question, but you know, is there anything that we can do to require or encourage our utilities to be maybe more proactive in their conversations with ratepayers? Is there anything we can do to try to soften the blow if tariffs go forward?
I apologize for failing in delivering the fundamental message that I hope you got from the common thread through everything in my testimony. So I apologize for that, Madam Chair. What I thought I was making clear is, one, the work continues as if this tariff was going to happen. So bringing it down to the customer Vermonter level, the work in some respects is not just continuing, but the collaboration among the parties that I've mentioned continues at a degree I've seen about maybe 4 or 5 other times in the last 25 years. So that work continues. Secondly, our department is focused on taking what the utilities given us, but also demanding and getting the answers and making sure that they are living up to their full potential and being as creative in defending Vermont ratepayers as much as possible. Secondly, and the only reason I can't be more explicit is because I don't want to get ahead of my boss on this press release that's coming, but it is precisely on behalf of Vermont ratepayers in the context of energy costs. What is the methodology and our focus, and who are we going to have on the team to ensure that we best consider options and posture Vermont to actually take advantage of this, if this is going to be what the world that we're going to be in? So in my judgment, I would say, and I'm certainly open to feedback, if I'm missing something, that wouldn't be the first time that's happened. But first you start with the utilities serving their customers. Next to the degree, if there's more of a statewide policy that will impact those people, that's when myself and our department and whomever else will address and make sure Vermonters understand. I just met this morning with the tip of the spear. Our consumer, the people who answer the phones with people who have complaints. I will tell you that. One, and this is consistent with the information and the data I had received prior to taking this position. Post-pandemic, people just have shorter tempers. members. Their tolerance for mistreatment is a lot lower. Their patience with finding solutions is a lot shorter. But this team does incredible work in helping Vermonters connect to weatherization and other resources to try and make that happen. I want to, and I'd be happy to share some of that information because it's really powerful. And having just met with them, I got a really good sense. So Vermonters are busy. So my guess is they'll see a headline, which is why I started with the lights are going to stay on. To the degree there might be cost impacts, we don't know yet. Further, we're working collaboratively to try and moderate any costs. At this, and then much more broadly, there's going to be an administration-wide effort to bring a greater focus and discipline and calm, rational assessment and developing of creative strategies to mitigate where necessary. I hope that's responsive. I intended it to be, but is that responsive?
It is. Thanks for kind of bringing that around because, you know, what I'm hearing is from people who are scared and they feel kind of helpless and they feel like we're at the whim of whatever comes down from DC and they want us to do something. So that was a great response and thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Quickly.
Yeah, and I would just encourage the department and the administration to include people's representatives as a recipient of good information and as partners in ensuring Vermonters are getting consistent information.
I am really grateful you said that, and I'll totally take you up and glad that and counting on that, I guess is what I would say. So thank you.
Yes, and I'm looking forward to hearing as things develop, which I'm sure you will keep us appraised of. Thank you very much for coming in.
All right,
Appreciate it.
thank you. Thank you.
All right. Running a few minutes behind, but Director Poor, yeah. So he warmed it up for me. There you go.
I did bring handouts again for you all. You know, if you don't want these in the future. Just to,
Sorry, TJ.
Our assistant for keeping the door open.
yeah. So,
Also serves as an intruder alarm.
I will say this to the commissioner too when we get back, but almost every meeting I've been in with him has run long. A lot of energy, a lot of good ideas. So I'm not surprised that we went a little over half hour. Okay, just bear with me while I get this up so I can share for online. Okay, Jack, if you can
Thank you.
allow me to share. Yep.
Okay, so you should be good.
Okay, well, thank you for having me back. For the record, TJ Poor, I'm the Director of Regulated Utility Planning at the Department of Public Service.
Thank you for coming back.
And so today I am planning on kind of going over part two. So we had the commissioner come in, immediate issues. This is more kind of level setting for the long-term issues that we will talk about with our current policies and programs as an overview. Last week I started pretty high level, talked about our utilities. Hopefully that gave helped in the foundation along with your other witnesses with, the type of things you were just hearing from the commissioner. One thing I didn't get to last week was forecasted load, and it says load and demand, forecasted demand, both annually and at peak. And then today we'll start talking about the programs like our energy efficiency programs or renewable energy standard and the programs underneath it, the standard offer, net metering, and then talk a little bit about grid evolution, grid design, load management, and resilience. So I will just jump right in like last time. Please do stop me with questions. I think it's good to have that kind of conversation. Just as a starter, how long do we have this afternoon?
You're the last person on here, so I guess we can go to 4 o'clock.
Oh, at least 6.
All right, well, my daughter's basketball team will just be coaching themselves at that time. So, yeah, that would be fun. We can have the 7th graders play you all.
Oh, that would be funny.
Yes. Okay.
What time do you have?
So yeah, a hair before 4 o'clock would be great. So I think I can get through everything by then. So we'll see. What has our electric demand look like as a state? The top left chart here that you're seeing is really the last 20, almost 25 years, and that demand has been relatively stable. It has not increased over time. In the bottom left, however, we see Belco's long-range transmission plan, their statewide forecast, and a lot of utilities use the same company right now to forecast their load, and we see increasing demand annually over time. And we see that both in, they did 2 policy cases, kind of like a business as usual, and then if we get really electrification of transportation and our thermal needs in order to meet GWSA requirements. And so we kind of stress the system under 2 different load forecasts. You can see it's increasing in both forecasts, either continued growth or increasing growth. On the right-hand side, you see forecasts of demand. Now that's, our peak load as a state. We have been a little under 1,000 megawatts for about 20 years. I think our peak demand topped out just over 1,000 megawatts in the mid-2000s, and we have not increased since then. What you see here is a base forecast, which is relatively flat going forward, and then you see a forecast with electrification in it. And this you can see with if we did nothing and just did electrification, our peak demand would grow really significantly. The top chart is the winter peak and the bottom chart is summer. We would very much turn into always winter peaking state. Now we're already doing things, so this doesn't take into account the storage that's on our system, which I'll talk about a little more later, and load management of electric vehicles. This assumes that electric vehicles come online and they just charge, when people get home from work, they charge their vehicles. We already have mechanisms in place to mitigate that, but in terms of how utilities forecast the system, they want to look at the worst case scenario first, plan for that, and then look at the measures available to them to move forward. So, and avoid those peaks. So, we are expecting growth in demand, but we have ways to manage it. Yes. Oh, sorry.
Victoria.
Quick question, I'm just curious, what they model for population growth, like, do they ever look at like the Vermont Futures Project and that optimistic?
It's a good question. I don't recall off the top of my head, but they do have growth built into the forecast, and I believe it's based on kind of some historical trends, as opposed to accounting for the potential for climate refugees, for example, right? So if that is not correct, I will follow up. Yeah. So one of the reasons why our load has been flat is that we do have energy efficiency utilities. I'll just talk about them now here. We have an energy efficiency charge on each customer's monthly bill, and that funds Efficiency Vermont. It funds Burlington Electric in its service territory, and it funds Vermont Gas Systems, has a charge on its bill. Efficiency Vermont serves all of the state except for Burlington Electric's service territory, and Burlington serves its own territory. The energy efficiency charge in Efficiency Vermont first came into effect for almost 25 years now, at the turn of the century. It really came about in the 80s and 90s. Electric utilities were encouraged, and at that time they made more money the more kilowatt hours they sold. And so they were not properly planning for the future and for the load they could avoid. It wasn't necessarily in their best interest to avoid load. And so there was a lot of battles on integrated resource planning and how they planned for the future. And ultimately the Public Utility Commission decided we'd be better off to have a statewide entity performing efficiency services for all of our 23 at the time distribution utilities. Hence we created Efficiency Vermont. Burlington Electric Department had a long history of providing good efficiency programs and was able to keep its own efficiency service delivery in its territory. So now it's a Public Utility Commission process where the efficiency utilities are appointed to an 11-year or 12-year term. It's called an order of appointment by the Public Utility Commission, and then they set the budgets every 3 years for electric efficiency. And they are required, 30 VSA 209 requires them to acquire all reasonably available cost-effective efficiency savings. And that's a lot of references to least cost planning, and that's 30 VSA 218C, which is the integrated resource planning statute. Our efficiency utilities also have some funds available for thermal and process fuel efficiency. Those funds come from proceeds from the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is I think there's 11 Northeast states that participate, where polluting generators are required to purchase carbon allowances. And
we heard from them.
Okay. Oh, great.
You can see what.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
And so we have revenues that are directed to our efficiency utilities for thermal and process fuel efficiency from there, and then also from the forward capacity market. Energy efficiency programs participate in that market, and the revenues come back to be used for thermal and process fuel efficiency. You can see the budgets here for our electric efficiency. About $50 million a year is being collected from ratepayers and spent on electric efficiency services. This does not count. This doesn't count the thermal and process fuel efficiency, which varies between $6 and $9 million. So what did that do? Well, I showed you that we've had flat load over the last couple decades. On the top left is Efficiency Vermont. You can see the blue is our load, and that's kind of been flat, that same picture as before. And the orange is what you can see Efficiency Vermont has saved and the resources they've acquired. and that totals about 15%, of our load, or it's said another way, our annual demand would be about 15% higher than it otherwise is, but for these efficiency programs. Same story from the City of Burlington Electric Department. You can see their history goes back a lot longer here. On the right-hand side is the potential going forward, the efficiency potential going forward. I wanted to include this because every 3 years when we set the budgets, the department does a efficiency potential study, how much efficiency there is. And there's different ways to define that. You see all the different levels here. But over the next several years, the potential is declining, and then it maintains flat. An easy way to think about this is we've gotten a lot of the low-hanging fruit in lighting, and it's a little harder to get cost-effective energy efficiency going forward. But the technical potential is declining, and then that program achievable potential is largely flat.
Quick question. That potential study, how much does that cost? That's done every 3 years, roughly?
It depends because we do it once, and in the past, I'm racking my brain because I used to do these, but like 10 years ago, and so more recent, I think $150,000 to $200,000 for that potential study, but we do that once, and then the next 3 years, we generally just update it because we don't need to necessarily go through all the machinations of creating that potential study. So we have a kind of a smaller effort every other cycle. And
May I follow up? Sorry, not to go off on a tangent here, but I think in the clean heat report that we got, there was a cost associated with updating the potential study every year, maybe? Do you know?
The report from the Public Utility Commission?
Yes.
Right, so if you update it every year, you wouldn't have to kind of set up the model and have the consultant, so I think it would be a little less. I don't recall what that price is.
I thought it was very high, but
right.
I will have to go back and look at it. Okay, thank you.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Okay. So I showed you the increasing load in the future, and these charts are a little bit old, but they're indicative. So the chart on the top is over the course of a year, the load profile in every hour for New England. And you can see there's it's New England summer peaking here, and over the a little lower demand in the shoulder months, and winter peak goes up. But we've forecast a 2050, and with electrification, we see a huge winter peak and a shift to focus on the winter. And so that really, and it is much higher. Our summer peak in 2015 for New England, 25 megawatts. And in this analysis, it was 35 megawatts of winter peak. So it really puts into focus kind of the timing of when we need resources and the opportunity to kind of avoid, to make investments to avoid those peaks. So we're really focused on the winter demand. Okay, so that was most of the stuff that I wanted to show you last week, but we ran out of time. And then I added the efficiency work. And switching gears here to our core policies and programs supporting renewable energy. So that go back to 1999 when we first passed and authorized net metering in the state. And net metering is intended to allow Vermont homes and businesses to generate their own power, for example, by putting solar on their homes. That policy is now 25 years old. It's had a lot of different versions over the years, it's been amended several times, and I'll talk about that a little more as we go forward. In 2005, the legislature passed the Sustainably Priced Energy Enterprise Development Program, otherwise known as the SPEED program. And that required utilities to sign long-term, stably priced contracts for renewable resources, right? So it directed our utilities, encouraged them to say, hey, go out and get new renewables, renewably sourced generation. What it did not do was require them to maintain the renewable energy credits for it. So it encouraged development or contracts for new resources, but it also, as a cost containment mechanism, allowed our utilities to sell the renewable energy credits to other states that had renewable portfolio standards at the time, or other load-serving entities in those states, to meet their requirements. So legally, we actually could no longer call that renewable energy because the other states had the right to call it renewable energy. But the SPEED program did encourage those types of projects. I believe Kingdom Community Wind was built under the SPEED program in Sheffield, those wind projects that they came online like in 2009, 2010, 11 range. But they were really started to be encouraged by this law, and until recently, the credits for those resources were the renewable energy credits were sold out of state. Moving along in the timeline, we passed the standard offer program in 2009, just a program to actually deploy small-scale renewable energy in Vermont, and by having the state government manage the purchasing of the energy, the Public Utility Commission would run a process to solicit power, and that changed over time. Originally, it was just a lottery. The first 50 megawatts of it, people were able to just line up, and if you were first in, you would receive a contract, and there was an administratively set price for that. Over time, that program was expanded, and in the expansion, it turned into a request for proposals process where it was more of a competitively priced process. And so overall, 127 megawatts of 127 and a half megawatts of power were solicited under that program and contract for. And then as we go forward, and I'll talk more about the standard offer as well. As we go forward, we had the renewable energy standard that replaced the SPEED program. And as many of you I'm sure know, that requires electric distribution utilities to buy an increasing amount of electricity from renewable resources over time, several tiers that I will talk about. I'll talk about those right now. So we have in the renewable energy standard, there are five distinct categories or tiers of requirements. The first tier is really total renewable energy, and eligible resources in that tier include wind, solar, hydropower, biomass, landfill gas, among others. Think of that as existing resources. Almost all resources, no matter when they were built, can count, just ensuring that we're getting that power, or we have the rights to that power from renewability. And just last year, that was updated to be 100%. We were required to have 100% of our power be from renewable energy. The timing of that is different for different utilities. Green Mountain Power is required to get there by 2030. Municipal utilities and global foundries by 2035. Vermont Electric Co-op is in the 2030 bucket. So under that tier, there are other tranches of renewable energy that are required now. And so tier 2 is what we refer to as the distributed generation tier. It requires 20% of your a utility's total load to be from Vermont connected resources. So you have to be connected to the distribution system in Vermont. And so that is kind of the in-state generation tier of the renewable energy standard. That previously was 10% by 2032, but was just recently increased. And again, the timing is different for different utilities. Green Mountain Power is required to be at 20% by 2032, and other utilities, municipal utilities, 20% by 2035. When I say connected to the Vermont distribution system, there is a size limit, so it's 5 megawatts or less. And this tier now also includes hydro plants that are owned by municipal utilities. So in last year's legislation, there was a nod towards those locally owned utilities who have had longstanding hydro units. As part of the reason that they were municipal utilities in some cases is because they had these hydro plants, and kind of giving credit for them as long as they are low impact hydro certified. So meeting a number of requirements for good operations. I'm going to skip over tier 3 for a moment and stick with the supply tiers here. Tier 4 is a new category as of last year and requires 20% of total load by 2035 for Green Mountain Power and 10% for other utilities to be from new renewable generation anywhere in New England. And that's a new tier, and it is additive. So we have 20% from tier 2, plus another 20% for GMP from tier 4. And then the remainder would need to be met by tier 1. So tier 1 is kind of a net tier. We have to get to 100%. Some of it has to be from tier 2, some of it has to be from tier 4, and the rest can be existing resources or other resources that are in tier 1. And I'll stop in a moment. There's another tier, tier 5, that is for those utilities that are already 100% renewable. If they have load growth above what their load was in 2024, then it sets a requirement for that certain percentage of new load growth must be met from new renewable energy.
Can I ask a question about tier 1 and 2 and 4? So tier 1 is all renewable, no matter when it was put in service. Is that right?
Correct.
And tier 2, it has to be put in service recently. And what used to be 2009, and now it's, or not, used to be 2015, now it's 2009. Is that right?
Correct. I believe it's by the end of 2009. Yes. Or after the end of 2009.
Okay. So, okay, so 2010,
effectively.
What, in order to count in tier 2, it has to be generation that was put in service starting in 2010.
Right. Correct.
Okay.
One of the reasons for that, I believe, is those speed resources that I talked about.
Yeah.
Those, as I said, those renewable energy credits were being sold out of state for those wind projects. So now there is a reason for utilities to keep those resources in state. I think the term that was being used is rehoming those projects. So it was keeping them in state. So utilities will forego the revenue that they were getting for that, but they will be able to use those projects in order to meet the requirements.
So the RECs are generated with a kilowatt hour of generation, or whatever it is, megawatt hour of generation, and then sold in a 1 year period, an annual period. Is that right? Or available for sale, available for use.
Correct.
Either retired with the utility or for sale.
Yes. So I just want to clarify one thing I said. So those bigger projects will qualify for tier 4 because they're bigger than 5 megawatts, not for tier 2. The standard offer projects were also a lot of those were also being sold out of state. And so those are smaller. They will qualify for tier 2. And so, yes, a megawatt hour in a given year can be used for compliance to your requirement in that year. Utilities are also allowed to bank their renewable energy credits for up to 3 years, I believe. And so, if I have more renewable energy credits than I need this year, I can say, well, my requirement's going up next year, I'm gonna save those and use them next year. Or I could choose to, if I have more this year than I need, and I think I have more next year than I need, I could then sell some out of state.
This can get very confusing to folks who are just hearing about this the first time. So
Yes, absolutely. So tier 3, I'm gonna just hold on. It is a separate tier that requires utilities to support fossil fuel reductions in their territory. And so I'll talk about that in a minute. That wasn't changed last year. Before I do that, I wanna just show you what this looks like in terms of how much of our supply will be met by renewable energy credits retired to meet our renewable energy standard. So you can see that tier 4 on the, sorry, it says tier 6, but it is intended to be tier 4. You can look at this slide so many times. That tier 4 is, on the top, and it gets up to in that last tranche about 15% of our total. Tier 2 gets up to 20% by 2035, and tier 1, we refer to it as net tier 1 because the tier 1 requirement, remember, is 100%, but that's net. What the requirement for tier 1 is net of what you've already gotten for tier 2 and tier 4. So they kind of fit within, and so you can see there's a big jump in those tier 1 required resources in 2030. That's when the 100% comes into effect for Green Mountain Power. We did not show tier 5 on this slide just because it requires forecasting when the projected load growth would be, and it would be really small here. Okay, so now I'm going to look backwards to what compliance looked like for the renewable energy standard in 2023, which is the most recent year that compliance period is done for. The reason that it's 2023 is that even through the first 6 months of 2025, utilities can still trade renewable energy credits for last year. So, December 31st, there was still power being generated, and so that power kind of gets settled in the marketplace, and we understand just how much was generated over kind of the first 3 months of the new year, and then there's another 3-month trading period, so everybody can kind of settle out and make sure they comply with their renewable energy standard. So in 2023, and again, this was under the old rules, you can see the compliance came for tier 1 came largely from Hydro-Quebec. So we talked about 24% of our total power supply is from Hydro-Quebec contract. That's included in here, and utilities made additional purchases of renewable energy credits from Hydro-Quebec. So about 2/3 of our compliance was from Hydro-Quebec, another quarter from other hydro resources, and then about 5% from that tier 2 resources, which kind of nestle into tier 1. When we look at what complied for tier 2, mostly net metering was used. Now, the net metering resources in Vermont, if a net metering resource transfers their renewable energy credit to the utility, they are required to retire it for purposes of the renewable energy standard. The compliance is mostly met with those net metering recs. I'll show you how much net metering we have in a little bit. The other solar is largely from either contracted resources or the standard offer. But like, as I said earlier, standard offer renewable energy credits had often been sold out of state. And there's a tiny amount of wind and hydro that are net metered. One important change that was made from past res to new res is these charts are based on the utility's retail sales. So the amount of the compliance was measured against how much utilities sold to end use customers. The new renewable energy standard is the requirements are based on total load. So if you think about the losses between the Velco lines on the distribution system down to the customer, 5-6% annual average, we actually increase the total number by which the res requirements are measured. And that's a good thing in our mind. We were, if we're going to apply a percentage requirement, we want to apply it to the total amount of generation that needs to be procured to meet our demand, and we were kind of missing those losses there. So for what that's worth, there was an important change there.
Can I ask a quick tangential question?
Sure.
Is there anything in the new technology, whether hardware or AI or other software, that can reduce those transmission losses? Or
Well, losses have been going down over time. You think about 25 years ago, we had 4 kV lines that just like this kind of the smallest gauge wire that you could actually put out to serve load. Those are mostly gone away. We have, bigger conductors and wires that go in, and that alone has significantly reduced losses. There are some technologies, I think, that you could reduce losses, just upgraded transformers, et cetera, those are usually as those systems are being replaced anyway. And the utilities are looking to do that. They don't want to lose electricity. It's expensive to have losses. And, in terms of AI and how we manage the system, I think the answer is yes, and it is how we look at data, how we are able to analyze data to better dispatch and operate the system. And I can tell you our new commissioner is really focused on this in particular, on how we can better use the tools available to us to actually have better information and better encourage our utilities to manage the grid. And so without getting into specifics, I think generally the answer is yes, and we're pushing and looking at what those tools can be. I don't think they'll ever get to zero.
No.
So,
They can't.
yeah, right. What are the value of those renewable energy credits? So I mentioned that we sell some renewable energy credits, or if we don't have contracts with resources, we need to purchase renewable energy credits. Well, it depends on the tier and what the scope of eligible resources are. And we often use our neighboring states as a guide to what the prices will be in Vermont. In particular, Vermont's tier 2 market is really small and unique. And so it's not a very liquid market regionally. So we look to Massachusetts trading price that kind of sets a standard for what the price is in Vermont as well. And you can see that there has been some volatility over the years, but over the last 5 to 8 years, it kind of settled around $40 per megawatt hour. And so, there's nothing really magic about RECs and renewable portfolio standards. Originally, they were intended to kind of be the source of the missing money for developers who couldn't kind of make their project work with what the prevailing energy market price is. And so we set a requirement and had for renewability, and the resulting market price was like, well, on top of your energy market price, this is the dollars that are necessary in order to get this project built. And that has settled in Massachusetts around $40 a megawatt hour, 4 cents a kilowatt hour above market in order to get projects built. Now, as the markets have gone forward, it's been a little bit less of a missing money type of thing, and it's more of a regulatory marketplace where all these entities are trading. But it's still kind of settled out at that same price. On the tier 1 side, now, just point out that the scales are a lot different on these two slides. So on our charts, on the right-hand side, we see tier 1 at a much lower price. So that existing renewables here in Vermont for a really long time was about $1 a megawatt hour, even less. You could buy them for 50 cents a megawatt hour. But it applies to a much bigger quantity of megawatt hours in the state. So it has a real, and it can have a real impact on Vermont utility costs. In 2022, there was a big spike in those prices. They went up to almost $10 a megawatt hour, so almost 10 times what we were paying before. And that showed up with real cost, with 50-60% of our load being required to have these resources. And so if the utilities didn't kind of have those in the bank already through contracts or having acquired them ahead of time, then they were kind of subject to that price spike. Those prices have come back down and since stabilized around $3.50, $4 a megawatt hour.
What was the exposure? Because we understand that it's hard for me to see the year, TJ.
Yeah, it's 2021, 2022, yeah.
So that probably aligns with some of the other Ukraine issues.
I think there was a couple of things that happened. There was, first of all, Maine, which has a more of a similar tier to Vermont, changed its rules for accounting. And so that caused and what resources qualified. And so that then caused there to be a supply shortage. Mm-hmm. And then on top of that, there was
a credit supply shortage.
Correct. Yes, a renewable energy credit supply shortage. On top of that, I think there was honestly some large generators and companies in New England that saw that and saw an opportunity and played the market and said, well, we're going to actually, they changed the rules. We're actually just going to hold on to our renewable energy credits, even though we don't have an obligation. We're not going to sell them to anybody. And then there was, people needed to comply with their renewable energy standard and were willing to pay more and more and more and more to do it. And so there was a little bit of gaming the market. And that's a negative connotation. I don't mean it really negatively, but there was a little bit of that gamesmanship. And then there was kind of the change of rules that, needed to be settled out. Ultimately, those prices are higher. We do, the dashed lines here are, there's actually forward markets for renewable energy credits. You can buy out forward a few years to cover your future obligations. And these are from broker quotes on, what you could buy them for as of December when we got them. But as we go forward further out into the 2030s, other states have 100% renewable requirement in Rhode Island or high percentage renewable requirements that will increasingly increase the demand for these credits. And will there be enough supply for these credits that will, how the supply and demand shakes out will ultimately determine the price, but there could be more upward pressure as we go forward.
So just on that spike that we see there, what was the real impact on rates in Vermont? So we heard from the commissioner earlier, the potential exposure from potential tariffs. What was do we know what the?
I don't have it off the top of my head. We could see if we have that information or collect it for you. Some utilities even benefited if they, purchased more than they needed at the 50 cents or $1 ahead of time, they actually could have had a net revenue from this if they sold some ahead or sold some at these high prices. But I can look into that, have the team look into it.
So the difference in the market value of these recs is because whether they're eligible for tier 2 or tier 1, right?
Correct.
Those tiers apply to Vermont's recs. How do they relate to the recs in other states in our region?
Right. So these charts are actually other states' trading prices.
Right.
And so, this Mass Class 1 rec trading price is close to what we would expect the Vermont Tier 2 cost to be, because those Vermont Tier 2 projects they're eligible in Massachusetts.
Okay.
Right? So there are some differences in eligibility. Size is one of them. I think the Mass Tier 1 or Mass Class 1, which equates to Vermont Tier 2, are in Massachusetts they can be bigger to qualify than in Vermont. And so Tier 4 in Vermont would be even more closely related to the Mass Class 1 here.
Okay, so these are approximate prices that a Vermont utility could sell a credit that they had earned that qualifies for tier 2 or tier 4, that they could sell out of state.
Right. Or that they may need to purchase at. And so we think it's a good proxy for a price, because a generator in Vermont, right, has a choice. We can sell this rec to a Vermont utility, or we can sell it to a Massachusetts utility, and they're going to choose, all else equal, they'll choose a higher one. Now in Vermont, they may say, well, we can sell it to the Vermont utility, and we can sell the electricity and the capacity to the Vermont utility and just bundle it and be done with it and have that contract for 20 years. And so the price may be a little different because of that. But, if you're just looking at a one rack and a megawatt hour, and it's kind of free, unburdened, you would think they would sell it to the highest bidder. That's what the market would encourage.
Okay, so is it possible to have trucks like this for in-state sales of tier 2 and tier 4, or no, tier 2 and tier 1?
So it's possible, except the reason we don't really show them is because the market is really not liquid. There's not a ton of people actually trading for the tier 2 resource. They all point to the Massachusetts Class 1, and same thing with the Vermont existing tier 1.
So there's not much trading.
There's not a ton of trading in the marketplace.
Within Vermont.
Right.
Vermont utility or to Vermont utility.
On those tiers, yeah.
Okay. Okay.
So what, a rec is 1 megawatt hour?
Correct. Every megawatt hour that's generated from a renewable resource also generates a rec.
Okay. And how many do we have in the bank? And who has them in the bank? Is it the state, the utilities?
The utilities bank them, and that varies by utility. I have a slide later on that shows our distributed generation resources above, the requirements over the last several years, and we'll see we have a lot of resources above what was necessary to meet our old requirements. And so there should be resources available going forward. But those resources had been, a lot of times they were selling those. I don't have an exact number for you right off the top of my head on how much we have in the bank and how much we cover, but there is some.
And how much can a utility make from 1 megawatt rec? And again, that's based here.
Right, yeah, so if it's a small solar, a rec from a small solar unit, they could make $40 for each megawatt hour. If it's just if it's from an existing hydro facility, then they could make $3.75.
Yeah, this whole concept of recs is, it takes a little time to get used to. If you've never seen it before, it's a little weird. A megawatt hour of generation is the number of electrons.
Right.
It's also this thing, this concept called a rec, which is a credit for that can be then traded based on the requirements of generation that each utility has under these different tiers. It's a good summary, okay?
Yes.
Somebody else up?
Just when, and I'm sorry, I apologize, I don't know if you've covered this before, but when those recs are sold by the utilities, they're typically used to lower rates, right?
Correct. Well, to lower rate pressure. So I just make that distinction because, a sale of RECs or a purchase of energy, it doesn't do anything to rates until the utility comes in for a rate case, or every quarter for GMP, they have a pass-through mechanism in their rates. So that one transaction, maybe, if they sold RECs, well, that may be offset by an increase in healthcare costs for their employees or something. And so, but it reduces rate pressure.
So have a generation online, like we talked about the global gas people. The BED has a oil fire plant, and Green Mountain Power over here in Montpelier has one. When these capacities, the utility gets credit, a capacity credit, for having the generation available when it's needed, do they not?
That's correct, yes.
And so if it generates, they then get an additional REC credit for generating that.
If it's renewable, yes.
If it's renewable. Right. For whatever the renewable source is. But with the case of the the non-muni utilities, any profits they get from either go to reduce their total money. They still get their rate of return on their invested dollars, but they can't capture more return because of the REC credits and the other dollars that are going to have generation available.
So Green Mountain Power, as the investor-owned utility in the state, is the only utility that makes any profit, right? And as you said, exactly right. They make their money on capital investments. So when they put money into the system, into infrastructure, that's where they make money. The markets that they participate in for the power supply, for capacity or renewability, has no impact on their profit at all. All of that is just passed through, both the costs and the revenues. And that's true for all the utilities in the state.
We should let you keep on going. You got a lot more slides.
That's right. So I want to highlight that I was really overly optimistic when I said I thought I could finish before. So we may.
Oh, we knew before we said.
Yeah, you were probably right.
Yeah.
Okay. So I want to briefly go back to tier 3. As I said, this requires utilities to make investments to cause reductions in fossil fuel for their customers. They have a requirement that started in 2017 and increases over time to 2032. And this chart here shows where their investments have come from to meet their requirement. And all the utilities have met their requirements thus far. My apologies for there being 8 shades of blue on here. It makes it a little hard to discern. Most of the investments that they've made in order to meet their requirement have come from heat pumps. And so that bottom blue is our heat pumps. So is the orange there. Basically the bottom 4 lines are all heat pumps. I think the second biggest investment to meet it has been, well, in the early years, there were some custom projects. Think of line extensions, well, there were also line extensions and service upgrades, but custom commercial projects. You can think of that project in JP, I think, Vermont Electric Co-op, turned the water park boilers from propane to electric. And that saved a whole lot of fossil fuels for their customers, and so that qualified here. Things like diesel operations for maple sugaring have qualified, or line extensions to have them operate on electricity qualified here. Overall, like over time, I showed this chart before last week, but I showed it without the green bars on here. These green bars are the impact of tier 3 over time. We can see in the early years, so from 2017 through 2026, there was actually a cost associated with tier 3. But over time, as the load is online, more and more cumulative load grows from the heat pumps, from the electric vehicles, et cetera. Actually the cost of those incentives is more than paid for over time, and you can start to see a negative impact, downward rate pressure here. The rest of the blocks here are estimated costs from the other tiers of the renewable energy standard, from tiers 1, 2, 4, and 5. And the black line is kind of the net costs, not kind of, it is the net costs here. So after you account for the additional revenue from tier 3. One caveat here is that it assumes that these tier 3 investments and the additional load does not cause the need for additional infrastructure growth. So you don't have to build new transmission lines to support the new load. That is not included here.
So these are costs, it's not showing revenue.
So revenue, if you look at the green blocks here, you can on the right hand side, it is revenue. Those are negative costs in this.
Okay,
yes.
all right.
Yeah. But overall, they are costs. The black line is the net cost.
So, okay, well, but the size of the green bar is so much less than the size of the other colored bars. So it's like a net.
It is a net cost, yes.
It is a net cost, okay.
Yeah.
But it's a lower net cost.
Than it otherwise would have been.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
How well can we quantify the benefits of this program?
So these are the above market costs to ratepayers. So we do forecast out what the wholesale electricity cost would be, and the power that is procured is assumed to avoid that cost, right? And what the capacity cost would be. And so we assume these do not include things, this chart does not include things like the social cost of carbon, which we can forecast, but this is more of a Vermont ratepayer impact.
But like, well, I mean, there's costs like, benefits, like if someone were to impose a tariff, we have our own in-state generation, right? There's costs, we haven't gotten into net metering, but the cost to having the energy produced where it's gonna be consumed. I mean, a benefit to that, the utilities fee, right? So there's all, and having a distributed system, there's benefits to that. There's also potentially cost depending on where it is, right?
Right.
So I'm just wondering, there's all these kind of soft benefits that, is there a mechanism to quantify all that kind of stuff or not? Not really possible?
Well, a lot of those items can be quantified. I mean, some of them are like a hedging risk. You have a long-term power supply contract, right? You're not subject to the volatility of the marketplace, right? And so, there's different ways you could estimate that. Some of them are, even if you just look at the difference between what you might pay a day ahead versus real-time market, there's like 4% difference. You could kind of say, well, there's a value there of hedging. And so some of those costs can be quantified like that. We have to be careful in terms of, when a utility may be oversupplied in certain hours, right? Then they are now selling into the marketplace, and so they actually take on more risk of that. So it really depends on this kind of even hour by hour position of the utility and what their resource mix is. So we can make some generalizations, and the work we did last year included a lot of values associated with things like a certain percentage of the infrastructure costs associated with the interconnection costs of a new generator in Vermont. A certain percentage of that goes to be a benefit of the system, and it's counted as a benefit. It's counted as a benefit in that analysis. And so there's a lot of gray area and room for disagreement on what some of those values are, but I think there is, a lot of those values are we know they're greater than zero, and so we should count something there.
See where James has her hand up.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe you'll get to this in an upcoming slide, but just to focus, a little bit more on some of the benefits of the res. I'm not sure if you have slides that show or quantify the way that greenhouse gas emissions will be reduced as a result of the res. I know that's something that we can quantify. And then I thought that we did have a fairly established method for kind of trying to get a handle on the social cost of carbon reduction. I think we have a model that's been approved, and I think that's work you guys have done to try to quantify the societal environmental benefits of the res over time, the savings there.
Yes, we do in the model that we have that developed this, we do have the greenhouse gas emissions impacts in there. And we do, the department does use, when looking at a societal perspective, the social cost of carbon. We actually were first proposed that 10, 15 years ago with in efficiency resources and quantifying efficiency resources. To use social cost of carbon wasn't the value then because it wasn't well understood at the time, but we used a different metric, and $100 a ton of carbon at the time. And when I say we, I mean the department was instrumental in pushing that for energy efficiency, and we were kind of right there with the social cost of carbon and transitioning and supporting that with the Climate Council. And so we use social cost of carbon for societal analysis. And I do think that is, and now we look to the Climate Council to kind of keep that updated. Actually, the Science and Data Subcommittee there is well suited to continue to update that as we go forward.
Okay. Are those slides coming up, or are those slides that you could submit to so that we have a fuller picture?
Sure. So I will suggest that if I'm invited back, I could present that as well. They are not in this slide deck, but I could include slides related to the social cost of carbon and the benefit associated with the RES.
That'd be great. I just want to make sure we're getting a full picture. So maybe quantify the greenhouse gas emissions reductions as a result of the RES and the social cost of carbon savings that you guys have modeled and documented as a result of the RES. And that way we can make sure we're looking at both sides.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I should have had those in this slide deck. We do, I think it's going back to what I mentioned the other day in terms of how we make decisions and evaluate. The comprehensive energy plan lays this out too, is we need to look at things from both a societal perspective and what happens, what is the impact globally of our decisions, and then also look at what happens to, what's the Vermont impact and what Vermonters are feeling as a result of these decisions. And those things are at times in tension. And thank you for raising that. And I will include it in future slide deck.
Great, thanks.
Rep. Sibilia, Morrow, Rep. Torrey.
Yes, just to pick up on this theme. So this slide is showing us a projection of RES costs increasing over time. But it's not showing us the net of, like what the cost might be if we did not have this regulatory frame, is it?
It's not showing the societal costs. It is, so these are the above market cost to Vermonters from the renewable energy standard. So if
This is sort of customer economics.
This
This is
ratepayer,
rate-
a ratepayer look.
So maybe I'm not expressing this. Do we have a look back in terms of, so we know that Vermont, and we've heard testimony from the commissioner, you and I know this from previous work, we know Vermont has some of the stablest and most and lowest rates in New England. And I attribute a lot of that to the RES. Do we have the ability to look back and see what the differential would have been without the RES?
Yes, we have. So every year we're required to do an annual report, and we have reported every year on what the cost is. In the past year, I will gather those into kind of look at what it has been in each year.
So not to be, I want to make sure I'm being clear. So you're talking about cost. This is the cost of an action that we took. And we know that the action that we took has created stability and lower prices than most of our neighbors in New England. So do we have the ability to quantify that, so our neighbors are paying more over time?
Right, you're making a connection of the renewable energy standard being the cause of our lower and stabler prices.
A contributor to it.
And so I'm not sure if that is true. And so because in the past, there have been, the renewable energy standard has required us to retire renewable energy credits. And those credits have been above market, and the power, so the requirements to purchase that power have been more than, have caused costs more than what it otherwise would have cost to secure that power.
So again,
the renewable energy standard has caused costs greater than what it would have otherwise cost to secure that power.
Over a long period of time.
Yes.
Or not on the spot. So in terms of time is what I'm trying to understand here, TJ. So I think over time, this has been beneficial, in terms of rates.
I don't believe so. It has had other benefits. So we've chosen to pay for example, like Chair James is talking about, those societal emissions reductions from the renewable energy standard. I don't have quantified the economic impact to the state of, solar businesses in the state, right? That's something that is not like readily, easily quantifiable that I could give you like next week. But the cost of the renewable energy standard, if we did not have it, we would have slightly lower rates.
So would utilities be making these long-term power purchasing agreements without the res? I mean, why are these other
they
states having higher prices than we are?
There's a lot of reasons. They're subject to the wholesale market prices, right? And
Which means they're not doing long-term purchasing agreements.
right, but the res isn't what has caused long-term purchases in Vermont. Yes, we do long-term purchases to meet the renewable energy standard, but we had the Hydro-Quebec contract, we had the Kingdom Community Wind is not a contract, but the Green Mountain Power built it, right? Sheffield contract, other contracts with wind resources in New England that were made before the renewable energy standard was in effect, and they're long-term contracts going forward. The contract with Seabrook, the power plant, goes through 2034, right? We have these long-term contracts. So the res hasn't caused long-term contracting. It has, long-term contracting is kind of one feature of how we meet those requirements.
But the res is not short-term contracting.
It is sometimes, not necessarily with a resource, but it can be with a resource. You could enter into a 5-year contract or a 10-year contract for a resource. There's a lot of short-term renewable energy credit purchases. That happens all the time. In terms of tier 1 resources, there's often, 3 to 5 year purchases of like the Connecticut River hydros owned by Great River Hydro. And so there's, the way it has worked in terms of a lot of small scale solar resources is that in order to get those built in Vermont, it benefits the developer to have a 20, 25 year contract, a known revenue source for all that time. And it does, the utility can say, okay, I know I'm going to meet my renewable energy standard requirements over time. I know pretty much exactly how much and when the solar is going to be online. And so there is that stability value, if you will, but the res has not been a cost reducer. It does have an impact.
Lots to discuss.
So I guess we need to, as Rep. James said, we'll need to understand what those other benefits are that we're buying, right, with that election cost. We still have Morrow, Troy's given up, and
Mine's an easy
Tucker,
one.
we're not gonna let you off the slide, TJ, so, all right.
I just wanted to know if there's an established definition of social cost of carbon, and if so, where would I find that?
There is the climate action plan actually describes it pretty well and gives a series of prices. So I'd point you there for that.
Thank you.
So my understanding is that the res adds about 3.5% to electricity rates. And that will rise to about 8% when we go to 100%. For what that's worth. And we still have the lowest rates in New England. And part of that is because the PUC has to approve rates here, where the other states have deregulated their markets. They don't have to get any approve the rates. Is that accurate?
I think part of it is the ability to enter into those long-term contracts. So we can strike when the market's low and say, here's the forecast that we think and enter into a long-term contract where those other utilities just ride the market up and down. And
presumably they could enter into long-term contracts if they wanted to.
The load serving entities cannot, 6 months to 1 year. That's why you see other states do state procurements of renewable energy. So you might notice that in the news sometimes that Massachusetts is going after and procuring, or Connecticut, 1,000 megawatts of offshore wind or what have you. Vermont doesn't generally do that, because our utilities are in the procurement business and they can enter into those long-term contracts. In Connecticut, the load-serving entities actually can't go and procure all that long-term energy, so the state needs to do it for
Why can they
renewables.
not do that?
Because the way the rules are written for retail choice, because it allows customers to then swap your provider. I could buy service from you and your rates go up and I don't like it anymore, and so now I'll buy from Representative Campbell. And if you had a big long-term contract that you had secured, then you would probably need to be bailed out afterwards, right? When everybody switched.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That helps.
Great.
Time check?
Yes.
Yeah, there's a basketball practice.
That's
I
right.
Oh my gosh,
apologize.
it's
I thought an hour and a half was going to be enough, and that was
You're our favorite.
terrible.
We asked too many questions.
No, it's great. It's a good conversation, and
It's very
it's
educational. I really
helpful for
appreciate
me
it.
too.
So I guess we should probably leave it there unless you have anything else you want to wrap up on.
I think that would be, I was gonna switch to the standard offer program and net metering after that, so,
Very easy subjects.
I do know that you're gonna have
Sign
the,
from the chair.
okay, so I think stopping would be good, yeah.
You've been given the hook.
All right,
Thank you, Director for your willingness to come back, and I hope willingness to come back again to get through more of these slides.
yes, well, I'm gonna add some slides
And
now,
add
so we
some
might go back.
Right, talk about the societal benefits of these various programs that we've been working on.
Great.
So,
Thank you.
Terrific. Are we gonna leave it at that? Anybody have any last minute questions or anything? Great. Good. James, we all set? Madam
Thanks,
Chair?
everybody. I'll see you all tomorrow.